Music can be a little hard to define sometimes. The label is used to describe organized sound across many different traditions by many kinds of people across the entire world. In this review, we will attempt to cover the basics of music, the different types and purposes of music, what music is made up of, and the roles of the people involved. In Section 1, we discuss the three common roles in modern Western music: the performer, the composer, and the listener. The first of these, the performer, has the role of interpreting the music created by the composer and allows the listener to hear the piece. With impressive technique or technical skill and an understanding of the composer's musical and emotional intent, a performer is able to act as the bridge between composer and listener. The role of performer can be completed by one person, a solo performer called a soloist, or an ensemble of people, meaning a duo, trio, quartet, quintet, so on and so forth, until you reach the size of a full orchestra. The second role is that of the composer. When creating a piece of music, or composition, a composer decides what the piece should sound like, what notes are played, how long they should be played, and how clusters of notes should be divided, which is all written down as musical notation. Using a variety of symbols on a staff, the shape and placement of these symbols indicate the duration and pitch of each note respectively. This is how the modern performer is able to play what the composer dictates. Western music has 12 notes in total, each given a letter name: A, A sharp, B, C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, and G sharp, though these names change depending on the context. When it comes to how a piece is divided, the composer determines its form. The composer utilizes unity and variety by adding or repeating musical ideas over the course of the piece. If a piece has repeated musical ideas, it features unity. Listeners tend to like unity, but to keep listeners engaged, a composer may also add variety. New musical ideas or variations on previous ones may be introduced. These variations are similar enough that the listener is comfortable and able to recognize them as the original idea, while different enough to keep them engaged. This especially applies when there is more than one performer. If, during a passage, there is unity between the performers, the passage is homophonic. If they are performing different strings of notes at the same time, it is considered polyphonic. As a whole, a piece can be performed appropriately in certain contexts, giving it a purpose. All over the world, music is used for festivals, dances, divination, politics, and communication. These types of music, which serve a specific function, are called utility music. Certain examples of these, or the specific instruments used, provide a connotation to the listener based on what context they've heard them in before. Divorced from connotation and utility, music can also provide satisfaction independently, or so absolutists claim. We begin Section 2 by talking about the third role involved in music, the listener. There are 4 common classifications of listener based on what they listen for. Casual listeners are the most common type of listener, who listen to feel a certain mood. Reverential listeners listen to music to imagine narrative or imagery. Certain pieces, called program music, have a specific narrative being told in the music itself, though absolute music, which lacks a narrative, may provoke certain images or memories for referential listeners regardless. Critical listeners analyze a performance's strengths and weaknesses, listening for any flaws and holding it to the highest standard, appropriate for the context, of course. And finally, the perceptive listener combines the elements of the other types, being able to analyze musicianship, mood, and connotation all at once. Like listeners, there are also 4 common types of music. Folk music is traditional utilitarian music passed down orally. Art music is the continued tradition of Western music from the 11th century onwards, containing both sacred and secular works, and often erroneously labeled as a superior art form to other types of music. Pop music is the widely distributed by mass media, usually with far less artistic intent than art or jazz music, the improvisation-heavy, largely unnotated music originating in the 20th century from Black Americans. 2 other important aspects of music when it comes to its sound are dynamics and timbre. The first of these, dynamics, refers to the volume and intensity at which the music is played, and can be used to control the emotions expressed by a piece. Dynamics were largely up to interpretation by the performer or conductor up until the 17th century, when composers began to notate intended dynamics in the Italian terms piano, forte, and their variants. Piano, meaning soft, can gradually rise to become a forte, meaning loud, in what is called a crescendo, literally meaning becoming louder. It could become softer over time to become pianissimo, in a decrescendo or diminuendo, meaning becoming softer. Several factors affect volume, including the intensity with which the instrument is played, the size of the ensemble performing, or the distance between the performer and the listener. The second aspect we covered, timbre or tone color, refers to the quality of the sound, specifically the qualities of each sound that help us differentiate one instrument from another. Like colors, there is a wide variety of timbres to choose from to fit a mood, with some working better than others. Timbre is determined by the shape of the sound wave, which itself is largely determined by the body that creates it, the instrument. Different instruments and voices produce different timbres. Instruments that share traits have similar or complementary timbres. Thus, it can be useful to have a method by which we can classify instruments. Historically, the method of classification used was determined by culture, like an instrument's patron deity or component material. Indian instruments have historically been classified by the kind of body that produces the sound: a string, a column of air, a membrane, or the body of the instrument itself. This is the basis of the modern Western classification system called the Hornbostel-Sachs system, created in 1914 by Hornbostel and Sachs. This system gives instruments the titles of chordophones for strings, aerophones for air, membranophones for membranes, and idiophones for the instrument body itself. The term electrophones have also been used more recently to describe instruments that use electronics to produce sound. A second related, yet distinct method of classification is also used in the West, based upon the groups found in a symphony orchestra. This Western symphonic classification, as it's called, separates instruments into families depending on where they are found within the orchestra: strings, woodwinds, brass, percussion, keyboard, or electronic instruments. The Western symphonic classification is commonly used when describing timbres in art music, specifically when the full orchestra is present. Like instruments, the human voice can also be classified. Humans' ability to sing, which we've been able to do since we developed vocal communication, predates any tools or instruments humanity has invented. Thus, the human voice could be considered the first timbre, and since practically anyone can at least attempt to sing, it seems to be the most popular timbre, for better or for worse. Vocal timbre is determined by the size and shape of the singer's face, mouth, and vocal cords, and can be positively or negatively affected by certain lifestyle habits that help or harm vocal health. We classify voices by the range of pitches that they can produce. From the highest pitches to the lowest, the classification of voices are soprano, mezzo-soprano, alto, tenor, baritone, and bass. These are helpful in determining what voice can fit a piece's average pitch range, or tessitura. Much like how multiple voice types come together in a choir, multiple instrument families are played together in the symphony orchestra, under the direction of the conductor, who keeps time and makes decisions regarding interpretation. The orchestra meshes many instruments across many classifications into one cohesive unit. String instruments are chordophones that can be bowed, strummed, plucked, or otherwise disturbed to make sound. Examples include violin, viola, cello, and bass, as well as the guitar, harp, and many more. Woodwind instruments are aerophones that alter the length of the air column by covering holes in the instrument body. Several examples, like clarinet and saxophone, have a wooden reed in its mouthpiece, with the bassoon, oboe, and English horn even having a double reed. The flute, however, has a mouthpiece, yet has no reed. Brass instruments are aerophones that often use valves to alter the length of the air column. They are made of metal and have a flared bell. Examples include the trumpet, tuba, French horn, and the slide-containing trombone. Percussion instruments are membranophones and idiophones that are played by striking the instrument. Many drums and other percussion instruments, like triangle, cymbals, and tambourines, have an indefinite pitch, while marimba, xylophones, and timpani do have a definite pitch and can be melodically incorporated into a piece. And finally, keyboard instruments are the instruments that utilize a keyboard to play. This includes piano, organ, harpsichord, synthesizer, and more. Each of these utilize unique ways of making sound. The piano uses hammers to strike strings, the organ utilizes pipes of different pitches, the harpsichord uses a plectrum to pluck a string, and the synthesizer uses electronics to create sound waves. They all, however, utilize similar techniques to play. Each member of the ensemble has an important role to play in bridging the gap between composer and listener. With all this information in mind, my peers and I may be able to appreciate music with a little more depth. Though many of us are casual or referential listeners, learning the basics of music may make us a whole lot more perceptive.